when you get to the second stage, something interesting takes place. There's a sense of, among many of us, the state isn't quite the continuation of that same heroic period. The latter rulers of the Hasmoneans may have gone astray. They might have been flawed. Even one of the great medievalists, the Ramban, Nachmanides, there's a very famous statement where he says that the sons of the Hasmoneans ultimately went astray because they became kings, and the monarchy, of course, in Israel belongs only to the house of David, and this is why ultimately the state fell. And so, as I said, we have this dichotomous image, and what I'm going to address today is it really that true? Is it that were the first leaders of the uprising only heroic, all that heroic, and were the latter rulers that flawed? Have they really gone astray? Or possibly, in both stages, are we given or totally under the impression left for us by the sources that we have? And here what I'd like to do is simply tell you, how do we know about this Hasmonean uprising? In other words, you have to remember, Jews did not preserve any of this historiography. Everything we know here, and all of these people that you have listed before you, some of them are mentioned in rabbinic literature, but the rabbis nowhere tell the story of the uprising in any detail whatsoever, nor do they tell the story of the state in any great detail. What we know for the first part, for the Hasmonean uprising, we know from the books of Maccabees, and in particular the first book of Maccabees, which came down to us through the Christian church, right? It came down to us through something called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible, something that was preserved. I'm sure everybody here in the audience, or just about everybody, knows what the Septuagint is, that famous, the story about king of Egypt, Ptolemy, who wanted to have a version of the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible in his library in Alexandria, and so he invited 70 sages, or he was sent 70 sages from Jerusalem, and then the great miracle takes place. They're each put into separate rooms, and miracle of miracles, they all translate the Torah verbatim the same way. In other words, as if this were planned, and they even make changes that are identical so as not to offend the queen or the king and the queen. By the way, I know I'm digressing, but a very smart man, by the way, whose widow just passed away last week, Professor Louis Feldman of Yeshiva University, who was for many people the first teacher of Latin or Greek. And Louis used to say, this is no great miracle. You're putting 70 rabbis in 70 separate rooms and they come up with the same translation. Put 70 rabbis in one room and have them agree on something. That would be a miracle, right? But we have the first book of Maccabees, and the first book of Maccabees really is the source for this first stage. The second book of Maccabees only really gets up to the beginning. It gets up to Judah Maccabee, but it certainly doesn't go beyond Judah. And we will see in a few minutes that the first book of Maccabees, when you examine it carefully, is almost a commissioned history. It's a work that is devoted to a justification of Hasmonean rule and monarchy, and in particular, not monarchy, but in particular, priesthood. And we'll see that in a minute. So that first source that we'll have to examine is for the Hasmonean uprising here. But the first book of Maccabees ends. It ends right in this period of transition from uprising into state, and when it gets up to the very beginning of John, here comes 1 Maccabees is over. And here we have to go to another source, which serves us for all of this period, and that is the Jewish historian Josephus. The only problem is, Josephus didn't live during the Hasmonean period. He lived much later, during the Roman period. So he had a source. Today we know who his source was, and we'll see that his source leads him in a totally different direction from 1 Maccabees. So let me show you what I mean. I'll give you an idea of how careful we have to be. The first book of Maccabees begins almost with the famous story of the king Antiochus sending an officer to the village of Modi'in, the priestly village where Mattathias and his sons lived. And the Greek officer sets up an altar and demands that somebody participate in this state pagan worship. Mattathias makes a very brave speech saying he and his sons will never give in. And then, by the way, you'll notice a word that keeps on appearing here. When Mattathias saw this, right, that a Jew, a renegade Jew, had come forward, right, to offer up a sacrifice on the altar, the pagan altar, Mattathias saw this, he burned with zeal, his heart was stirred, he gave vent to righteous anger. Look at all the heroic terms here. And what does he do? He ran and he killed this renegade Jew on the altar, and he also kills the officer who had set up the altar. And he burned with zeal, and it's very, very obvious that the author here presents Mattathias as a second coming, as a second version of Phineas ben Salu, who also kills a renegade Jew who is about to give in to the enticing of the Midianites, sending their women to entice the Israelites to have some sort of illicit relationship with them. Now, you have to ask yourself, why the example of Phineas? Why have Mattathias? You can say that what is similar here is that both Mattathias and Phineas kill this renegade Jew. And here, just to bring things alive, this is the famous picture of Dory, of Mattathias killing the renegade Jew here. And here you have another picture of Phineas killing the renegade Jew, Zimri ben Salu here. But is that the only reason that 1 Maccabees conjured up the image of Phineas? Not at all. There was a much more important reason for the author of 1 Maccabees to describe Mattathias as being the second, as I say, the second coming, or a new version of the zealotry of Pinchas. And that becomes obvious when you continue reading in 1 Maccabees chapter 2. Mattathias, on his deathbed, makes this long speech, right, this long testament to his sons. And what does he tell them? Phineas, our ancestor. In other words, first of all, there's a familial line here, but it's more than that. Because he was deeply zealous, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. In other words, my zealotry, Mattathias says, should justify the priesthood that the sons of the Hasmonean family will take for themselves, just as Phineas deserved to become high priest because of his zealotry. In other words, 1 Maccabees, from the very beginning of the book, makes it clear that he has an agenda. His agenda is to justify the taking of the priesthood by the Hasmoneans. And remember something, the Hasmoneans were not high priests until the uprising. There was another family of high priests. We know who they were. A fellow by the name of Onias, then there were at least 2 Hellenized high priests.
And then you can
so
see
that,
how much is going to the shipping is in fact going to be free as I think it is. And then you can see.
Can you okay, thank you. So what you have here is a vested interest by the author of 1 Maccabees to justify the Hasmoneans becoming priests, and that justification will continue throughout the book. Let me give you an example of how 1 Maccabees sort of argues for the Hasmonean family as being, quote, the right family. There's a little story, an anecdote in the 5th chapter of 1 Maccabees, and I'll make this long story short. Judah Maccabee and his brothers are enjoying victories all over the country. Once the rebellion takes on some speed, they spread out and they recapture portions of the land in Gilad and in Galilee. And 2 Jewish minor generals, commanders, their names here you can see are Joseph, son of Zechariah, and Azariah. They're jealous. Why should the Hasmonean family get all the credit and all the glory for their victories? Let's instigate a little war of our own, right? And will be victorious, and we'll also get some of the praise and credit for the Jewish victory. And so they instigate a little war, and sure enough, I go down to the bottom here, Joseph and Azariah were routed. They were pursued to the frontiers of Judea. 2,000 Israelites fell. In other words, this was a great calamity for the Jewish army because of what these two minor commanders did. It was a setback for the people, because they had not obeyed Judah and his brothers, right? In other words, they did this on their own. But now comes the best line. And if you had any doubts where 1 Maccabees is headed, this next line says it all. Why did the two brothers fail? It isn't just a lack of discipline in the army. They were not of the family through whom Israel's deliverance was given. Why did the two commanders fail? They're from the wrong family. And so 1 Maccabees makes it obvious that I call this a commissioned history. Now, this is not to say that Mattathias and Judah Maccabee are not heroes. I'm not saying this. What I'm saying is that the only source that we have for this uprising, or for much of this uprising, comes from a history that has a vested interest. And I call it almost a commissioned interest because of what we find towards the end of the book. And now I'm skipping to chapter 14, which is almost the culmination of 1 Maccabees. When 1 Maccabees gets to the rule of Simon, the last Hasmonean brother, when in fact the state became an independent state, the author of 1 Maccabees describes what goes on in Jerusalem to render the state a legal status and a recognized status. In other words, here you have a flow. The flow of the book goes from Mattathias emulating Pinchas, hence justifying priesthood, to the culmination, which is the just establishment of a Hasmonean state. They gather, the Jews and their priests resolve that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise. In other words, there was a large meeting. Let me see if I skipped this. I wanted to show you this first. On the 18th of Elul. Look how formal this document is. On the 18th of Elul, in the 172nd year. This is the 172nd year of the Seleucid Empire. It's interesting. They're going to now declare independence from the Syrian Seleucid Empire, but they're still using the calendar, the Seleucid calendar. But they add something. In the 3rd year of the great high priest Simon. In other words, when you count years to Simon, that's a statement. You are independent. In Azaramel is a difficult word. It probably means in the Azara or something. In a great assembly of priests and the people and the rulers of the nation and the elders of the country. In other words, what is this? This is the constitutional gathering of all the recognized leaders of the people. The following was proclaimed, and now comes the proclamation. They made him, Simon, leader, high priest, because he had done all these things. And again, he and his family basically freed Jerusalem and the country from the Greeks. And then, as I got to this, this is striking. The Jews and their priests resolved that Simon should be leader and high priest forever. Now, this is interesting. Simon becomes the leader of the people. He becomes the high priest. In a few lines, he also becomes commander of the army. They're setting up an autocracy. They're setting up something that never existed before. We never heard that high priests were also kings, right? And so the author of 1 Maccabees may have realized he has a problem here, or maybe this document, whoever wrote it up, had a problem. And I would imagine that when this announcement was made, a number of eyebrows were raised. What's going on here? How are these people putting together, right? What justification they have for setting up such an autocratic establishment?
Could I interrupt for a second? Who do we believe wrote 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees?
Very good question. It's anonymous. We don't know who wrote it. We do know one or two things. A, it was written in Hebrew. We only have a Greek translation, but the Greek translation makes it obvious that the original text was in Hebrew. There were all sorts of signs that it's a translation. It was written in Judea, right? The author knew exactly the geography of the land. He knew the layout of the land. He makes no mistakes geographically, as does 2 Maccabees, which was written abroad. It was written in North Africa and partially in Egypt. But we don't know who it was. We have no idea. Although, if you ask me, I would suggest it's something very close to a court historian. In other words, the man has access, whoever the author was, he had access to official documents. He's able to quote, for instance, one of Judah Maccabee's great successes. By the way, I keep on thinking about this literally today, and today meaning the last couple of weeks. Judah strikes up peace treaties with very important other states, right, to gain recognition that had never existed before. Sounds familiar, right? But of course, the most important peace treaty, or not peace treaty, but rather mutual defense treaty that Judah strikes up is with the Roman Republic. And this is in chapter 8 of 1 Maccabees, where they set up a mutual defense treaty, meaning if anybody attacks the Romans, the Jews will not support that enemy with arms, with boats, with what have you, and vice versa. And, you know, I always imagine, you know, that when this announcement was made in the Roman Senate that the Jews are on our side, Judah Maccabee and all of his, I don't know, 500 farmers, right? You almost can imagine the sigh of relief coming out of the Roman Senate. Oh, the Jews are on our side. Now we have nothing to worry about anymore. It's clear that that's a statement more than anything else. In other words, the author of 1 Maccabees is projecting this family as being very astute, both on the battlefield and diplomatically, right? And so they were appointed leaders, but he says he does one thing, which is very interesting. Simon will be leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise. I love the juxtaposition of these 2 words, forever, until. I mean, if it's forever, then it's not until, then it's forever, right? But what I like to call this in Israel is, this is the coalition phrase. In other words, if there's anybody out there in the audience saying, what's going on? These people are taking too much power into their hands. The author here says, no, don't worry, don't be disturbed. This is all provisional until a true prophet shall arise. In other words, when we have a true prophet, we'll know what to do. We'll rearrange everything. And this, of course, was meant to assuage certain doubts that people might have had about what the Hasmoneans were doing. And there were people who had doubts. I mean, we know that under the early Hasmonean stage already, some people left Jerusalem. We think that the Dead Sea sect, or one of the Dead Sea sects, moves to Qumran exactly at this time. They could not abide by this type of new leadership, and it's clear that ultimately within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find attacks on at least the latter of the Hasmonean leaders. But what we have here, this is my point. For the first stage, Mattathias, Judah Maccabee and his brothers, there is no way that we can look at them as anything but heroic, because our source is totally given to this idea. When we reach the end of the Hasmonean state, things change. And let me give you an example. First of all, we are in the hands of Josephus. But Josephus slavishly follows his own sources. And when he has conflicting sources, he doesn't know how to overcome this all the time. And I want to give you an example. One of the first Hasmonean rulers of that second stage, the state, is a fellow by the name of Aristobulus. Here you see Aristobulus I, who is the brother of Alexander Jannaeus, who precedes Jannaeus by 1 year, right? And Josephus describes this fellow Aristobulus, right? Now, of his brothers, Aristobulus loved only Antigonus, who was next in age, and he considered him worthy of a position like his own, while he kept his other brothers in chains. So he basically imprisoned, Aristobulus imprisoned all of his brothers. He also imprisoned his mother, who disputed the royal power with him, and carried his cruelty so far that he caused her to die of starvation in the prison. And to the death of his mother, he added that of his brother Antigonus, the only brother he loved, he also killed. So you'll agree with me that the presentation here is very definite. He is not what we would call in good English a tachshit, right? He's not the greatest fellow, according to this source. He kills off his family, or he kills off his mother and his brothers, and so on. You flip to the next page in Josephus, and you get a summary of Aristobulus 1. He had a kindly nature and was wholly given to modesty, as Strabon testifies on the authority of Timagenes. This man was a kindly person, very serviceable to the Jews. And you ask yourself, what's going on here? The guy just killed off all of his family, right? Matricide and fratricide, and he's a nice guy, right? And it's clear that Josephus had two sources before him. The nasty source is the first one, and we know today exactly who that source was. He was a fellow by the name of Nicholas or Nicolaus of Damascus, and his claim to fame is he is the court historian of Herod. Herod the Great, who will succeed the Hasmoneans. Herod was an enemy of the Hasmoneans, not just an enemy. He was an opponent that decimated the Hasmonean family, killed off the last Hasmonean high priest, and his historian, Nicolaus, follows Herodian policy. In other words, if you're serving Herod, you are going to be anti-Hasmonean. And for Josephus, that was his main source for the later Hasmonean stage. And so our source now is so tainted that there's no way for us to really get to the true image of the Hasmonean monarchy. Again, I'm not saying that they were all heroes, and we'll get to this in a minute. But everything that Josephus knows about the Hasmoneans comes from an anti-Hasmonean direction. Let me give you an example. Alexander Yanai, one of the Hasmonean kings, at a certain stage, attacks the city of Gaza, right? His monarchy was saved. He was under attack at first by one of the sons of Cleopatra. Cleopatra managed to save the Jewish state. She comes out in support of Yanai, and then Yanai is free to at least attack some of the Greek cities in the neighborhood of Judea, and one of them is Gaza. And so he invades the city of Gaza. And look how Josephus describes this. And you've got a sense of where Josephus, who he's following, what type of a source. The Gazaeans, however, held their ground, did not yield either through lack of supplies or because of the number of their slain, for they were ready to suffer any fate rather than fall into the hands of the enemy. Josephus's source is a pro-Gazan source and an anti-Hasmonean one. And if you want to really be convinced of this, look at the continuation of this very same story. At first, on entering, meaning Gaza, Alexander acted peacefully, but this was really subterfuge. But subsequently, he loosed his forces on the Gazaeans, and they went off killing the Gazaeans. These, however, the citizens of Gaza, were no slouches, but on the contrary, they defended themselves against the Jews with whatever weapons came to hand. But now comes the interesting line. Some of them, meaning the citizens of Gaza, being left alone, set fire to their houses in order that nothing may remain in them for the enemy. Others, with their own hands, made away with their children and wives, this being the means by which they were compelled to deliver them from slavery to their foes. Remind you of anything, right? The defenders, right, being outnumbered by the enemy, had no recourse but to kill off their families. It's Masada. The only problem is that we're the enemy here, right? The Gazans are the heroes here. They're the ones doing the Masada suicide, right? Because they don't want to fall into the hands of these terrible enemies. What is the bottom line here? The source we have before us is a decidedly anti-Hasmonean source, and Josephus copies it straight, right? He has no control over his source. And these are the types of sources that fashion much of our image of the latter stage of the Hasmonean stage. Now, there are also rabbinic stories that certainly portray Alexander Jannaeus in an unfavorable light. And that doesn't surprise us. Once you have a state, you have different parties, right? And clearly, we know that the Pharisees, who are the forerunners of the rabbis, many of them were not happy with Alexander Jannaeus' behavior, although there were those who did support him. There's no one approach, either in rabbinic literature or in subsequent literature, to the Hasmoneans. And this is a very common mistake. People think that the rabbis came out against the militaristic approach of the latter Hasmoneans. They were into battles, and there are those historians, and I'll make this point very clear now, who are convinced that the rabbis built up the miracle of the 8 days, right, of the oil, as a means of covering up the military victories of the Hasmoneans. This is a very common theory. It's a mistake. And this, I'd like to clear this up. This is an optical illusion. The fact, I wrote an article about 20 years ago on this, and I did something very simple. I gathered up every reference in rabbinic literature to the Hasmoneans. And what you find is that 90% of the references deal with the military victory and not with the oil lighting for 8 days. Now, I'm not saying, yes, miracle, not miracle, but to assume that the rabbis stressed the miracle as opposed to the victory, to military victory, is simply a mistake. I brought a few references, rabbinic references, to the Hasmonean victories. They did battle and defeated the Greeks, and that's why we kindle lamps to this day. Or in Genesis Rabbah, right, crushed the loins of his adversaries. Into whose hands does the kingdom of Greece fall? Into the hands of the sons of Hashmonai, and so on. Or the story of Nicanor, the Greek general, who would point at Jerusalem and say, I'm about to defeat them. But when the kingdom of the house of Hasmoneans prevailed and defeated them, and so on. And this is why, so there are a lot of references to the military victory. Hence, I totally disagree with Yerushalmi, famous historian, taught at Columbia for many years. In his book, Zachor, Yerushalmi echoes what many historians thought at one time, that the rabbis ignored the battle of the Maccabees in favor of the cruse of oil that burnt for 8 days. That's simply an optical illusion. Why are we so aware of the miracle of the oil? Because it appears in the Bavli, it appears in the Babylonian Talmud, which for centuries was the most studied book in Jewish society. So everybody knows what the Bavli says in Tractate Shabbat. But the fact is that when you go to the other Midrashim throughout, or even the Palestinian Talmud or Midrashim, they all, in fact, refer far more often to Hasmonean victories. But I want to go a step further. We still have a few more minutes, but I've got to do this. The fact is that subsequent historians, even modern historians, added their own spin that again tended to play down the Hasmonean era. And I want to give you one very, I think, a very telling example. Here, by the way, I'm going to skip over that. Here we have a British historian of the early 20th century, Edwin Bevan, who taught in London. He received an honorary doctorate at Oxford, and he wrote a book called Jerusalem Under the High Priest meaning the Hasmoneans. And look at how Bevan describes the Hasmonean state. It appears to me a question whether it was not at great spiritual cost that the Jewish people allowed itself to be launched by the sons of Hashmon upon a career of carnal strife. In other words, already you have a nasty description here, right? Bloodshed. Now, what was the great spiritual cause? For the Jewish people could not be amenable to the same laws as ordinary nations. What annoys Bevan is that the Hasmoneans are acting like a normal nation. It should have been more like a church, Israel. And what do you have here? You have Christian theology here. This idea of a spiritual Israel, that the true Israel, or what the church would later on call the Verus Israel, right? The true Israel, should be a spiritual entity. They have no need for an army and for territory and for all the trappings of statehood. It should have been more like a church. And the laws of the church's life were in that degree the true laws of its being. That's what real Israel should have been like. And what the Hasmoneans are doing is totally against the spirit, right, of a spiritual entity. And then Bevan draws his conclusions. Look at this. Under the blast of Jewish conquest, civilization in Palestine withered away. Civilization. This is an interesting word. The word civilization comes from the Latin civis, which means city. And in the Greek world, civilization, culture, is really an outgrowth of building a city, a polis. The Greeks thought that the Hasmoneans were, in fact, the ultimate enemy of civilization. They are capturing Greek territory and Greek cities and turning them back in history to Israelite cities. So civilization in Palestine withered away. Would there have been prosperous cities? Were heaps of ruins. Fields went back to brushwood. Roaming bands of marauders had free course in the land. Such a state of things marked the zenith of Hasmonean power. You can choose whether this is simply, I don't know, it sounds almost anti-Semitic, right? But certainly anti-Hasmonean, of course. But what you have here is something interesting. You have here a Christian theology being grafted on the antipathy of the Greek world towards the Hasmoneans. In other words, the Greeks thought the Hasmoneans were simply anti-civilization, and then the Christian theologian comes and adds to that the aspect that they weren't spiritual. They were doing what other people were doing. And these types of expressions, in other words, when we begin as far back as Josephus, and then to modern times, you find this antipathy, this discomfort with what the Hasmoneans did, even though what they were doing, and now I'll get to my bottom line here, what they were doing, in fact, raises the question of what was their legacy. And, you know, I'm going to talk about this map in a second, but it's very common. But do I still have 5 minutes for a story? Okay. I know that in Israel, I'm not sure this is a common question abroad, but I know that in Israel, people used to love to raise the question, why did the Hasmonean state fall in the end? Why? How could the Romans, or why did the Romans, through what did the Romans capture the Hasmonean state? Why did it fall? And many, many years ago, when TV was just arriving in the state of Israel, this goes back over 30 years ago, close to 40 years ago, actually, I participated in a TV program, which by then was still all talking heads. They would invite 3 people, ask them a question, they're sitting behind the table, and they all talk. And the name of the program was, Why Did the Hasmonean State Fall? And they invited 2 politicians to answer. And then I was invited to represent the truth, because you're not going to get the truth from these guys, right? You're going to get politics from these guys. And they put these 2 representatives. They sat them down on the table on both of my sides, one to my right, one to my left. I hasten to say to my far left, right? And they asked each of them, you know, why did the state fall? And the fellow to my right said, well, the state fell because it was divided. There was civil war between the sons of Alexander Jannaeus just prior to the Roman conquest, and a country that's fragmented into different political parties and military parties can't last. It was doomed to fall to the Romans because it was divided. There was no unity. Then they turned to the fellow on my left and asked him, why do you think this Hasmonean state fell? And he said, well, of course it fell because they extended themselves, right, by capturing territory. And within that captured territory, there were non-Jews, and we all know that conquest corrupts, and so, et cetera. You know, the various mantras. And so, of course, it became a corrupt state, right? And when a corrupt state is ultimately going to implode, and that's why the Hasmonean state imploded and was conquered by the Romans. Now, I'm sitting listening to these 2 people, and I know why the Hasmonean state fell. It fell because the Romans showed up in the Middle East, and they were conquering little lands like Judea for breakfast, right? And there was no way that we would keep them out. I always like that I played with these 2 politicians, and I said, you know, let's take both of the scenarios that you suggested to their conclusion. Yes, the country was divided. And I always imagine that the country was not divided. Let's imagine there was no civil war. And there's Pompey, the Roman general in Syria, and he has to describe, am I going to invade Judea? He would have said, of course, what? Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II united together. The Roman Republic can't conquer these people. They're too strong. Let's go looking for a divided state to conquer. Then they would have left us alone, of course, because there would have been no civil war, which of course is ridiculous. But no less ridiculous is the other side. The state fell supposedly because it was no longer an upright or a righteous state. It had become corrupted through conquest. Let's imagine that it wasn't corrupted. Let's imagine that the two sons of Janaeus were off in yeshiva somewhere studying, that Alexandra Salome was in the palace reading whatever, pious women read at the time, Tehillim or Senarena or whatever, right? Then, of course, Pompey would have said, we can't invade Judea. These are upstanding, these are righteous people. Let's go looking for some corrupt state to conquer. And they would have left us alone. Of course, this is ridiculous. In other words, Rome conquered us or the state because of Rome was conquering all of the Middle East at the time. Our question should be not why the state fell, but what was the legacy? What was the state that the Romans conquered? But what state did they encounter when they arrived here? And they encountered a number of very important things. This is the true legacy of the Hasmoneans. First of all, the Hasmoneans achieved one thing, granted by conquest. They united all of the Jews of the land of Israel at the time. This was the first time that you find a unity in the land from the days of David and Solomon, right? In other words, they are grafting, they are carving out together a Jewish identity throughout the land, and this will be critical. But it's not just, in other words, a people all connected one way or another to Jerusalem, to the temple, to priesthood, but it's more than that. You find that the Hasmoneans strike coins with Jewish symbols. In other words, there's an identity that's being cultivated, even by the latter Hasmoneans, who at times may have been cruel and may have been, may have had mercenary armies, but you have a state with people with an identity. By the way, if you look at this menorah here, that was on one of the coins of Mattathias and Tiganus, very similar to, if you have a 10 agorot coin at home, look at it, you'll find the very same menorah. That the state of Israel copied these symbols. But it's not only that. We have the Hebrew language that was also maintained. Here you have on one of the coins, that on the other side of the menorah coin, in nice Hebrew, Matityahu Kohen Gadol. And if you look at the next, I put together a number of Hebrew inscriptions on Hasmonean coins, all from the latter stage, not from the heroic first stage, but from the latter stage. There is a national identity that's being preserved. My point is this, and I'll end on this, that the legacy of the Hasmoneans was that they preserved a Jewish identity and I would say community that would be conquered by the Romans. But once the Romans conquered this Judea, they keep it as a Jewish community. The Romans did not enforce persecution upon the Jews with an attempt to eradicate Judaism or Jewish behavior. And the fact is, though, that the Romans encountered a Jewish identity, and the Romans actually referred to it as a religio licita, as a legitimate religion. And for me, this was the achievement of the Hasmoneans. And I think that that's the way we have to look at this. In other words, yes, the first stage is certainly heroic, but the second stage, I think, achieves something also. And we have to be aware of that achievement and grant that to the latter Hasmoneans as well. It would be only fair not to claim, we don't have to claim that none of them were ever misbehaved or flawed or what have you. But that's the nature of leadership. What we have to do is look at the grand picture. And I think the grand picture, nevertheless, convinces me at least that what we have here is a tremendous achievement, not just the miracle of the 8 days. Let's stop. Are there questions? I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. I will, if people want to send questions, I will read them. Until then, I'll share a few of my own and those that someone else shared with me. The first question is, we as Dati Jews, as Orthodox Jews, we generally get our information about Hanukkah from the Mishnah Gemara. Where's the source that you think that's based on? Were they basing it on Maccabees 1 and 2 or something else?
Actually, there's very little history in rabbinic sources, right? In other words, they know that there was a military victory. They know that there was a miracle of the 8 days, but there's no description. I mean, let me show you how little we know from rabbinic literature. Were it not for the Christian church, right, that preserved the book of Maccabees in the Septuagint, none of you would have ever heard the name Yehuda HaMaccabee.
Crazy.
You know, we all assume Judah Maccabee, the great hero of Judaism. He's not mentioned anywhere in rabbinic sources, right? We would have no idea who the guy was. So there's very little history per se. What there isn't anecdotal history. In other words, they'll tell us a story that John Hyrcanus sent 2 of his sons up north to capture a city, and at the same time John Hyrcanus was high priest, and a voice came out of the Holy of Holies and informed him, your sons have been victorious. That's anecdotal. That's an anecdote, but it's not the history of the Hasmonean state. So, and by the way, as people have mentioned, there's no tractate Chanukah in the Mishnah, right? Mishnah hardly talks about Chanukah when you think about it. It talks about lighting, there's this issue of the lighting of the candles, but not the history of the Hasmonean state.
And there was a Dafka decision not to include Maccabees in.
We don't know.
Oh, really?
I'm not sure. The whole issue of canonization is still enigmatic. It's still a problem. I mean, by the same token, we don't even know when the Book of Esther was canonized. We have portions of all of the books of the Bible that were found at Qumran, save for the Book of Esther. And when the Book of Esther reaches Egypt, something very interesting happens. There's somebody in the Greek-speaking world, this could have already happened in Judea, but then it moved to Egypt, that was very uncomfortable with the Book of Esther. Why? Because there's no mention of God, and there are no prayers. And what you have is a Greek version of Esther that's more dati than our Hebrew version of Esther. The Greeks have Mordechai and Esther praying. In other words, these are additions that render it more kosher, as it were. It could be that they weren't enamored with the first book of Maccabees, but then it also wasn't all that kosher. The book of 1 Maccabees reads like a military history produced by Tzahal today, right? In other words, these are the facts. We fought here, we fought there, we were victorious. I'll give you another example. There's no mention in 1 Maccabees of Kiddush Hashem, of being willing to die for Jewish religion. That only appears in 2 Maccabees, which was written in Chutz La'aretz, which was written outside of the land. The mother and her 7 daughters, the mother that we later on call Chana, Mishivat Banel, but that's a much later version of that story. It appears in 2 Maccabees. But 1 Maccabees is a straightforward political history. And as a result, it addresses political opposition, it addresses, but mainly it addresses warfare and the astuteness of the Hasmoneans in drawing up connections, political connections, not just with Rome. They have correspondence with Sparta and with other entities as well. In other words, the Hasmoneans, according to 1 Maccabees, are very astute, and that's why we have this image of them. When we get to the rabbis also had an agenda. And there's nothing wrong with their agenda, right? But they're not historians. They have for them, there's a higher truth than the historical truth. And we have to appreciate that. So I'm not here to belittle that rabbis, but I'm saying that their interests lie in another direction.
The other question that was asked of me to ask you is the latter period that you talk about, the Hashmonaim, and the reputation that they weren't very good. What was going on at the time, do we know, in terms of prayer and learning and any semblance of Yahadut that we can...
First of all, even according to the rabbis, the latter part of the Hasmonean state is considered to be one of the ideal eras of Jewish existence. The rabbis say that in the days of Shimon ben Shataf and Shlomtzion HaMalka, Shlomtzion is Janaeus' wife, the queen, and the chief rabbi, I use the word chief rabbi, it's a modern phrase, the most, I would say, astute rabbi is Shimon ben Shataf. In those days, we're told that barley grew to the size of kidneys. In other words, because the people were so righteous, agricultural produce outdid itself, so much so that they actually put these large, whatever it is, kidney-like barley, they put them in jugs to preserve them for subsequent generations, so that subsequent generations would know how important it is to be in the service of God. And in other words, this is considered to be a great era, even the Hasmonean era. You take a guy like Alexander Janaeus. The rabbis, on the one hand, describe him as being cruel in one place, and yet in another place, they describe how on his deathbed, he tells his wife, don't fear the Pharisees or those that are not Pharisees. You only should fear the hypocrites, right? Who behave like Zimri ben Salu. The hypocrites who behave like traitors and then demand a reward like Pinchas, right? In other words, that's a positive statement on Janaeus' behalf. And so there is no one image of the Hasmoneans in rabbinic literature. A great historian, Gedalia Alon, who taught at the Hebrew University, died in 1950 or 51, I don't remember. He wrote an article once, did the Jewish people eradicate the memory of the Hasmoneans? Or did the rabbis eradicate the memory of the Hasmoneans? And he came out with a brilliant study saying that's not the case. In other words, we have to realize something in subsequent eras. For the Middle Ages, these military victories did not resonate. And that's why, again, they were very interested in the miraculous, in the spiritual. When you get to the 19th century, the Maskilim were, especially the anti-Zionist Maskilim, had no need for a national spirit that the Maccabees or Hasmoneans ultimately came to symbolize in Zionist circles. See, and this is something we have to realize, that people are playing fast and loose with the Hasmoneans. Everybody embraces them, but for their own purposes. One of the great examples is near the village of Modi'in. There's an Arab village called Midia, which is right near modern-day Modi'in. And in the early 20th century, there was a school in Tel Aviv sent its kids on a day trip near the village of Midia. They asked an Arab there, can you show us the graves of the Maccabees? Kubur al-Yahud, the Kevarim of the Yehudim. And they pointed out a series of graves, and this became the site of the graves of the Maccabees. There's only one problem. All those graves are good Roman graves, right? They have nothing to do with Hasmoneans. Yeah. But the spirit of Zionism was so important in the early 20th century that for years, there would be a famous torch race to the graves of the Maccabees who were buried there, right? Which I always thought was ironic. Here the Maccabees were fighting against Hellenistic culture, part of which was athletic prowess, right? And so what are we doing? We have a marathon race to the graves of the Hasmoneans, and to have old man Mattathias roll in his grave. And as I say, the only grace is that we know he's not buried there, so he doesn't see it, right? But again, everybody's using the Hasmoneans.
Maybe would have been happy that we own it now. I have one question. I'll share one last one, and then we'll end the session from either Robin or Danny Amster. It's hard to tell with these Zooms. What are the lessons for today? We take such pride in the IDF and its accomplishments, as well as all the studying that goes on in the Yeshiva. Sort of that question about that balance of the emphasis of the
right.
talk.
I think the lesson for today should be obvious, right? That we're looking for a balance, and the rabbis were not, someone like Shimon ben Shataf, who's considered really to be one of he's the fellow who, according to the Palestinian, the Talmud Yerushalmi, established the education system in Israel. It was Shimon ben Yasha who decreed that children should go to school. Right? This is telling. This takes place not in Roman times. This takes place under the Hasmonean state. In other words, there is a clear-cut agenda, even in the Hasmonean, not even in the Hasmonean state, to preserve Jewish identity, and this covers a whole range of things. And so, yes, I might not be happy with everything the Hasmoneans did, but I have to be careful not to follow vested interest sources, agenda-driven sources. I mean, the example I gave, I spoke to a group here in Israel, and I said, could you imagine if I were to set out to write a biography of Netanyahu, and my main source would be the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, right? Or I'll give you an example that resonates in the States. Let's say you were going to write a biography of Trump, and your most important source was the New York Times, right? What would the biography look like? And this is our problem. We try to talk about the history of the Hasmoneans, but for part of that history, we're using the anti-Hasmonean sources, such as Nicolaus of Damascus. We have to overcome that. We have to ask ourselves, what was their achievement, right? And the achievement is obvious. Remember something. We're surrounded in Judea in the first century by a whole slew of mini-states that vanish. The Nabateans and the Idumeans and the Tyrrhenians up in Lebanon were all swept by this wave of Hellenization that basically eradicated national entities or ethnic entities and created one large, what the Greeks called ekumene, one large civilized land. It was the Hasmonean state that set up a barrier against this wave of Hellenization. Even though they themselves were Hellenized in many ways, they start using Greek names, they have mercenary armies, but there's a national identity. And as a result, it's not by chance that the Romans continued to call the land Judea, right? And this was a telling issue because it was only after the Bar Kokhba War, years later, that they changed the name to Syria-Palestine. In other words, they conquered a land, but the land remains Judea, right? And this is an important point. And that is the sole achievement, or the most important achievement of the Hasmoneans. Yes.
Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing your Hanukkah Sunday with us. And we look forward to meeting in person and hopefully hosting you at some point in West Orange, New Jersey.
I would love to do that.
Hanukkah Sameach to everyone, and thanks again.